Practical Anarchy, Guide to Self-Determination, Dickie Dredd. Part 60, Anarchism, Colonialism and Liberation. Colonialism is one of the clearest examples of power imposed from above. States extended themselves across oceans, drew lines on maps and declared ownership of lands they had barely seen. For centuries, empires justified domination with stories of racial superiority, religious duty, and the supposed benefits of civilization. For anarchists, colonialism represents the state and capital in their rawest, most violent forms, conquest backed by military force, extraction of resources, and the deliberate crushing of self-organising communities. Anarchism's challenge to colonial power has always been twofold. First, it exposes how empire relies on the same logics as the domestic state: control, hierarchy, taxation, policing and surveillance, themes explored earlier. Second, it insists that true liberation must come from below, not by replacing one set of rulers with another, but by dismantling the structures of domination altogether. Indigenous struggles provide some of the strongest examples. Across the Americas, many peoples deliberately resisted centralised authority, preferring village councils, clan networks and seasonal assemblies. European colonisers called these anarchic tribes as an insult, yet for anarchists they are reminders that non-hierarchical structures are not utopias dreamt up in books, but lived practices that survived despite centuries of attack. Contemporary movements such as the Zapatistas in Chiapas or the Mapuche resistance in Chile have drawn consciously on these traditions, combining indigenous identity with horizontal forms of decision making. Black liberation movements also carry anarchist echoes. Refusal of slavery was itself a refusal of total domination. Maroon communities in the Caribbean and the Americas created free zones outside both plantation and state. Later organisations like the Black Panthers in the US practiced community self-defence, free breakfast programmes and health clinics, experiments in mutual aid that challenge both white supremacy and capitalist neglect. While not always calling themselves anarchists, these practices of autonomy and solidarity embody anarchist principles, echo themes that will be addressed in later sections. Decolonisation after 1945 brought formal independence to dozens of nations, but it rarely dismantled the deeper structures of power. Colonial states were replaced by new elites, often tied to global capital and backed by the same police, prisons and armies. Anarchists argue that this flag independence is insufficient. True liberation cannot come through new states, however anti-colonial their rhetoric. Instead, it emerges through grassroots federations, cooperatives and communities taking back control of land, labour and culture. Religion too played its double role. Missionaries often accompanied soldiers, preaching obedience and labelling indigenous practices as savage. Yet liberation theology in Latin America and movements like Gandhi Swaraj in India turned religious conviction into weapons of resistance, calling for communities to rule themselves and reject imperial domination. For anarchists, the lesson is not to place faith in holy community, but to recognise how spiritual traditions can sometimes fuel defiance against colonial hierarchies, a theme connected to resistance within religions. The link between colonialism and capitalism is stark. Plantations, mines and trading companies were engines of profit for imperial centres, binding colonised peoples into systems of wage slavery and debt. Today, neo-colonial structures persist through the IMF, World Bank and global corporations, extracting resources under the guise of development. Decolonisation in this sense remains unfinished, tying directly into what sections we talked about earlier. Anarchism's contribution to decolonial politics is to keep the horizon open, not simply the right to run one's own state, but the right to live without rulers altogether. From Rogerver's democratic confederalism to land-back movements across the globe, we see glimpses of what that might mean: federations built from the village level, communities practicing mutual aid and struggles that unite ecological survival with cultural survival. In this sense, colonialism and its afterlives are not marginal to anarchist theory, but central. They show how domination operates on a planetary scale, how racism and empire intertwine with class and capital, and how resistance must be both local and global. Anarchism, colonialism, and liberation are not separate strands. They are interwoven, reminding us that the fight against rulers is also the fight against empire, and the freedom of one people is bound up with the freedom for all.